Domain 1 is really focusing on the foundation of doing prevention work. And that has to do with planning interventions and evaluating interventions. When I say evaluating interventions, it's important to think about that during the planning phase, not at the end. An evaluation is incorporated all the way through the planning, implementation, all the way to the end.
A lot of our work really rests on your ability to effectively plan and then measure what you're doing, which evaluation really is just getting at how are you measuring what you're doing.
How do we take something from the very inkling of an idea, take it through to acting on it, and then make sure that the action we put on it was actually helpful. And so it really takes you through that whole process, and again, really, like a lot of things you do in prevention, takes you almost back in a circle, right? It takes you back to, all right, we've done one thing good, hopefully, and we've evaluated it. We know that this thing worked. How do we keep influencing this problem? Or how do we figure out now what needs to be impacted, what needs to be changed because we've already successfully helped this one thing? So I think that sort of feedback loop that you keep getting is great. And if you have a foundation in the pieces of planning and evaluation, then you know how to speak a lot of different languages about prevention. So you know how to speak to someone who's really interested in numbers about the good work that you're doing. You know how to speak to someone who's really interested in storytelling about the good work that you're doing. And you know how to show that this isn't just, oh, we had a problem with a substance and so we put up a poster about it, right? You have that work, you have that evidence to show that you have been systematically working through a process that in itself has been shown to get great results. Just the process itself has that evidence and that research behind it. And so going through a process, you have that foundation both kind of for the big picture science, but also like the direct work that you're doing in your community.
If I were to think about some of the competencies that are critical to this domain, I think a lot about some of the what I would call soft skills that lay outside of those competencies. I think being able to think more broadly and strategically, the ability to really look at things acutely, of course, is important because we're in the health field and we're serving people, and so the things that we're doing impact people. But I think in order to plan well, you need to be able to step outside of that and really look at the big picture. And then just as importantly, measuring how much of an impact that you're able to make and how close you're able to sort of move towards the goal that you've set for your prevention program, or more broadly like a municipality or a state government. I think having some basic data literacy, and what I mean by that is just kind of understanding how data works. Data is one of those things that I think can be overwhelming, and I think sometimes you'll hear people say, I'm not a data person. But honestly, I think to do well in this work, you really have to get comfortable with data. And when I say basic data literacy, just really understanding kind of the power of data. Data can be really, really powerful. And I think especially in this line of work, people are well aware of that. So there's a lot of, I think, responsibility that comes with the power that data has. And so just understanding kind of what it can do, what it can't do, its limitations, is critical for anyone that's in this field, and especially anyone using data. And then I would just kind of call out to the strategic prevention framework, of course. I think that is a pretty critical piece of guiding what strategic planning should look like. I'd go as far as to say any sort of planning model is better than none, but being rooted in the strategic prevention framework, the SPIF, I think is something that's allowed us in Massachusetts and all of the communities that we fund to do this work strategically. And when I say do this work strategically, just be as effective as possible in stewarding limited resources to serve as many people as possible.
When I'm thinking about planning, the first thing I look at, what are the data telling us? What are we knowing in terms of the risk factors and the protective factors within the population that we're going to be working with? What do we know? And what don't we know? And what do we need to know in order to plan? And that's where we know if we need to do some key informant interviews, do we need to do some survey work, do we need to do focus groups to make sure that we are planning in the right direction, right? So I tend to have, that's where I spend most of my time. This is also a chance for you to work with your partnerships. Who in your community is really important to be involved in thinking about this right from the beginning. Not later on, but literally right from the beginning. For buy-in purposes, but also to make sure that you're not hitting unforeseen glitches that you may not have thought about because you're thinking in your own little mind. So it's important to have opportunities to collaborate. So that's how I start when I think about planning. And when the data tell me this is the problem, these are the protective factors, I gathered some more information. Now I know this is the problem I want to be able to address. The partners that I'm working with agree this is the problem we want to address. And the partners that I agree how we're going to address that problem. What is the best intervention or the best approach? That's how I start with that. In addition to that, incorporating how am I going to evaluate what I'm planning? How do I know it's going to work? So if we're going to do pre and post tests right from the beginning because it's a curriculum, or are there other data that we need to be able to collect throughout? It varies depending on what the intervention looks like, but always to make sure whatever we're planning, we're incorporating the evaluation right from the get-go.
When you're new to prevention, the thing you've seen, maybe the only thing you know about prevention, is the implementation piece of that whole big domain, which, for a lot of the planning processes comes between planning and evaluation, right? You've got this planning, then you implement it, and then you evaluate how it's been doing. So sometimes you may have only seen some stickers on some beer cans in your local grocery store. So you've maybe only seen the action. So I think it's good that we highlight that that's just one piece of it, because there was a whole lot of work that went into figuring out why that was the action to take in that community specifically. And then there's a whole lot of work that goes in to say like, hey, we think this is going to work. Is it actually working? So I think it really highlights kind of that it's not just, we don't just throw actions out there. We really want to make sure that we're thinking, as a system, both way before and way after we do the action. Having that rigorous evaluation in place for programs that you want to sustain, for things that you want to keep doing, really helps get those folks on board who maybe, unfortunately, maybe their only kind of prevention thought is a sort of, 80s just say no piece, right? They've only maybe heard the negative about prevention. They've maybe only heard oh, prevention is where we take things away from people, right? So they maybe haven't heard the positive side of that. It's whoa, no, that is decades ago. We are building protective factors in folks. We're building that resiliency in our populations, and that's adding. That's not just saying you can't do this and then leaving you with so what do I do now? Right? This is really, finding those strengths, finding those other passions, finding those things that your community can get excited about in a really healthy way. And so I think having that language around here's what this does is so helpful for giving people a more three-dimensional view of what prevention is.
The other area that I'd want to emphasize about Domain 1 is that we need to look at our resources and the readiness of the community. One of the things that I learned early on, because I made mistakes, is in my enthusiasm to, get the ball rolling in prevention and get interventions out there. I didn't think about how ready is the community for this. And so you plan, for example, a parenting program and no one volunteers, no one comes. And that's because maybe the community is not ready. Maybe they need more public awareness. Maybe they're still in denial, blaming the neighboring community and saying it's not here. And so you need to do that readiness work first before people are ready to implement the program. One of the things that I say too is, you've done a good job. I'm quoting Lao Tse, a Chinese philosopher. You've done a good job when all is said and done. People congratulate one another and forget that you're there. So I really believe that in the planning process, one important piece is to empower the community, not only to acknowledge the problem, but to own the problem and then own the solutions. And so we're really trying to work ourselves out of a job. And so the tools that we use in prevention now is the coalition work. So while we are doing programs in specific settings, we're really working on policy change and changing community norms, because we learned that from tobacco, that our norms around tobacco didn't change when we educated alone, but when we started changing policy, increasing the cost, limiting the places where people could smoke, then that changed.
I think about cultural competence as a journey, not an end destination, because you can learn a lot about one culture and it changes, and there's a lot of subcultures. In terms of working in communities, understanding what communities are there and what sub-communities are there. And I think the best way to do that is getting embedded in meeting with community members and asking questions. I think anytime we make assumptions, we're not being culturally, we're not having cultural humility. As long as you're asking questions and you're constantly learning and you're not making assumptions, I think there's opportunity for growth. I think people like to be able to share kind of their cultural context. And I'm not talking just race and ethnicity, orientation, gender, things like that. I'm also talking about youth culture. I'm talking about urban youth culture, rural youth culture, suburban youth culture. They all look different. And when they're all embedded with each other, you have to understand that those subcultures are existing all at the same time. I also am a firm believer that I believe that we should have just assumed that everybody in the audience has had a trauma experience, potentially, may or may not be LGBTQ+, and may or may not have a family history of substance use disorder. So if we come in with that level of humility and we look at our interventions that way, we tend to be more successful.
Getting that data can often be part of that relationship building, especially for new prevention professionals coming into a role. Maybe you're picking up, in the middle of someone's logic model, or maybe you're picking up some of the work they've been doing and sort of checking back in. Getting that data can also be like, hey, I'm the new prevention coordinator for our coalition. It's great to know you. Any updates to your data?
There is data nationally that shows that communities that faithfully implemented the SPIF process had greater success than those that did not. And so there's a lot of, we have outcomes now. We can prove that the process works. And I think that's encouraging for folks.